If you work in the Kremlin, it's probably a good time to ask for a raise. As the West has torn itself apart over the past few weeks, Russian President Vladimir Putin has likely been bouncing around his palace, dishing out the vodka and asking after everyone's babushka. At least that's the view from Europe. And while, depending on your point of view, Russia may have much to be cheery about right now, the picture there is far from rosy. Cut off from the Western world and its economic riches, with hundreds of thousands of soldiers dead and much of the Black Sea Fleet destroyed, Russia is not the country it was in 2021. An operation in Ukraine that was meant to take 3 weeks has instead stretched to 3 years. And that is taking its toll. So, should Russia be happy with its lot? Or has it actually lost the war in Ukraine? I'm Christian Smith, and welcome to this podcast from Geopolitical Futures. And with me again is someone who certainly believes that Russia has lost the war, Geopolitical Futures chairman and founder George Friedman. Hello, George.
Hi there.
George, we're here in large part to talk about what's next for Russia and why you think it lost the war. But I just want to spend a little time, first of all, on the latest developments in the past week or so out of the US, on that press conference, because I just think that a lot of people will want to know your thoughts on that. I mean, what did you make of the press conference with Zelenskyy and Trump in the Oval Office?
Well, first you have to understand American strategy. The United States determined during the war that Europe is useless, that it could not truly participate, it was not united, it really was a marginal element in this war. Today they have this idea of the coalition of the willing to do what? So the Americans are bypassing the Europeans as irrelevant. And they've decided that, one, the Russians are not a threat. Their demonstration of their military force in Ukraine was pathetic. The threat of an invasion of Europe, when they couldn't take in 3 years, Ukraine is not there. Therefore, the Cold War is over, and the animosity between the United States and Russia, which is, of course, the United States' vast amounts of money and risk and everything, that now there might be an entente, an understanding. The United States has a historical heritage of doing such things. After the war with Japan, we made Japan a great ally and rebuilt it. After the war with Germany, we did the same. When we find ourselves in a dominant position, we build alliances. So there's nothing radical in Trump's strategy, except perhaps his tactics. But what he's trying to do is move past the Cold War, talk to an enemy who we can debate, was he defeated or merely blocked or whatever, certainly failed in his intention. And at the weak point is certainly under tremendous pressure inside of Russia from the oligarchs and others. This is the time to negotiate. And to negotiate is always useful to make the other guy think you're nuts and weak. So he is putting Putin in a position to reassure him, to get Putin to understand what Trump wants, accommodation. The events with Zelenskyy, I think, were staged. I have no proof for it. Trump has a bad temper. Zelenskyy is there pleading for help, and he loses his cool in front of all the reporters. Now, under both of them went simultaneously nuts, or they decided to go in. Why would they do that? Well, Trump wants to separate himself from the Ukrainian war and from Zelenskyy, to reassure Putin that this is not some sort of strategy to get him to step down and then we'll strike, which is a military possibility, but not going to happen. By showing that he is not a supporter of Ukraine, showing that Zelenskyy was enraged by this, his goal was, I think, by inference, because I don't think he's stupid and I don't think that Zelenskyy is crazy. His intention was to show in front of reporters that he is not a supporter of Ukraine, that he's not a threat to Russia. And remember, the Russians began the war because they were afraid of the threat of the United States. And that opens the door to negotiations that have been going on for weeks now.
When you say that you think it was staged between the two of them, do you mean between Trump and Vice President Vance or between Trump and Zelenskyy?
Both.
Between all three?
We wanted to show the Russians that this isn't a maneuver to get him to step down, and then we're going to jump into Ukraine and charge. By proving there's a rift between the United States and Ukraine, this reassures Putin, who himself is in a very fragile position now. Putin would love to end this war with some dignity. Trump would want to give him that dignity. And what we've been doing in the past is bypassing Ukraine, trying to make that a marginal issue, and talk directly to the Russians. It's worked very well to this point. It could shatter. But why should we have animosity to the Russians at this point when they demonstrated that their threat to Europe is non-existent, where the Europeans could not be relied on, and where we were worried about the Chinese? In other words, this is the end of the Cold War. And this is the American strategy at end of wars. Make peace and build.
And it's just around now as well, in the last day or two, depending on when this podcast goes out, that the US has paused military aid to Ukraine. I mean, this feels like a significant, a radical moment, perhaps. I mean, what do you make of it?
I make of it it's a continuation of reaching out to the Russians. Far more important than what happens to Ukraine is ending the Cold War. And that depends not on what the Europeans do, but on a reconciliation of some sort between the United States and Russia. That was the Cold War. What Trump is signaling is he is not intending to use Ukraine as a base to attack Russia. What Russia signaled is we can't attack Europe. Therefore, the fundamental reason we were aligned with Europe was to provide a Russian attack. To stop a Russian attack, I should say. That's no longer an issue. And the Europeans now saying, well, the Russians will come. Well, they couldn't take the Ukraine in 3 years. They're not coming. So this is the moment, and Trump knows it. And he may appear a fool, and he probably is insane. I'll grant all these things. But he's not stupid. He became president of the United States, controls both houses of our Congress. Stupid people don't do that, don't achieve that. So take him more seriously and see him as engaged in a very subtle maneuver.
Before we move off the US, just very quickly, George, I want to talk very briefly about Vietnam, because half of the point, as you've said before on a number of occasions, half the point of the US sticking with Vietnam was to prove America's dependability as an ally. And putting to one side what Trump is trying to do here, as you say. Now, after what happened in Afghanistan and then whatever might happen here, is the US at risk of becoming an unreliable ally, not just in Europe, but to countries like Australia, Taiwan?
The United States entered Vietnam because it was a communist country. The Cold War was not just a confrontation between Russia and the West. It was between communism and capitalism, if you will. Russia was maneuvering all over the world to stage communist revolutions. Vietnam was a communist country. The war in Vietnam saw Southeast Asia as a whole turning communist. So there was another dimension to the Cold War, the ideological one. We went into Vietnam, just as the Russians did into Ukraine, thinking it'd be a cakewalk. We lost 50,000 people. It was a mistake militarily, but it flowed out of the basic strategy, which was to educate Russia with communism, and we were fighting the communists. So from that point of view, it is understandable why we went into Vietnam. What was not understandable was the military's inability to grasp the nature of the enemy, his strength and his capability, and his willing to fight. So there's a parallel between Vietnam and Ukraine. At that point, but the United States could recover. It took several years to bring domestic contention to a close, some time to rebuild confidence in itself, and so on. There's a lag time after it. The Russians have ended that, are trying to end the war in Vietnam, if you will. But then they're going to have a period, they're going to have reconciliation. Our defeat in Vietnam did not weaken us to the extent a defeat in Ukraine weakens Russia, because our military power remained intact in Europe and so on. But again, bear in mind that in the war in Vietnam, the Europeans were irrelevant. We did not consider this important. We had to demonstrate that the Russians could not, and failed to demonstrate, could not be spreading communism. Now, at this point, the ideological dimension is gone, and it's now the purely geopolitical.
Right, let's dive into Russia now then, and why it has lost the war. You've already said there about the fact it's because its military has proven it's incapable of taking the country. I mean, I want to take us back to sort of first principles and ask the question of why Russia started the war in the first place. As a number of people have recently said, they've argued that Russia has got what it wants out of the war by controlling a number of the eastern provinces of Ukraine. You don't see it that way. Talk us through that, George.
Well, the problems, they're not looking to control the eastern thing. They invaded the entire country. Their forces entered on four axes, one aimed at the capital and reaching the capital of Kiev. If you take a look at the reality of the war, they were trying to conquer all of Ukraine. Now, having failed, they say, I only wanted this. That's one part of it, the equation. But the basic problem that they had was they were afraid that the United States would attack them. They had seen the fall of Khrushchev, the rise of Gorbachev, and a series of prime ministers who were hopeless. They also had recently seen the United States operating in the Balkans in a fairly intense war. Remember, he came to power in part because the Russians couldn't deal with the fact that the Americans were making military operations that close to their border. They were afraid they were next. The distance between Moscow and the Ukrainian border is 300 miles along Route 3, a road that could be traveled rapidly and other roads leading to it. The deepest fear of the Russians is the memory of Napoleon and the memory of Hitler, all going from Moscow to their heart. They're normal people, and they saw the Americans acting militarily and said, are we next? And they came to the conclusion, one, they needed a new leader. Putin emerged. Putin looked at the board and said, I need a buffer. Ukraine was the buffer of Russia historically. It was now floating free somehow in the wilderness. It was the highway into Ukraine. If Ukraine fell, Moscow is 300 miles away. Therefore, he preemptively struck to push the border back, to make an American attack more difficult. So if you think of the time at which Putin came to power, the Americans were acting in his mind very aggressively, and he feared he was next. So he did a rational military thing, looked at Ukraine and said, we must take it. We must have the buffer, the depth. The problem was what he needed to do and what he could do were two different things.
And of course, a lot of evidence has come out since the start of the war of the attempts in the early days to decapitate the Ukrainian government as well. I mean, I suppose what you think about, I guess what you're saying there, George, is whether or not it's reasonable for Putin to have wanted that is somewhat irrelevant. That is what he wanted.
What he needed. The Russians needed strategic depth. It would be very much like somebody seizing Florida and we'd be waiting to see what their next move was. He couldn't wait to see the next move. He needed a buffer. This is military strategy 101. He needed that additional depth so that a Russian army could form a defensive force against an American attack. He genuinely believed that, and it was not an irrational belief. That was the origin of the Ukrainian war. After Maidan, the riots in Kiev, he took the view that this was the Americans behind it. I won't say we were, but, we didn't mind it. He saw that as an attempt to make Ukraine, which had been part of Russia in the past, a base of operations against the Americans. He didn't know this to be true, but as president of Russia, he had to take it into account and look at the worst case scenario. And looking at the worst case scenario, he was convinced that he was making a defensive move against the growing American threat. And he made that threat. And his strategy was take Ukraine, build my defensive line there. And his intention, and we could see that very clearly when we see the beginning of the war. You see the long line of Russian tanks. Remember the pictures. The Russian logistics system broke down. They could not fuel their tanks. But those tanks weren't headed against the east. They were headed against Kiev. Okay, they were in Crimea, coming north. They were on multiple fronts. They were trying to take the country. I understand why. But they were not ready to wage a war even against Ukraine. After the fall of Khrushchev, the Russian military weakened, fragmented, and thus.
I just want to come back to something on what you said there. In terms of the idea that Ukraine, that Putin needed this buffer in Ukraine. I mean, of course, many in the West, or most in the West, really see that as abhorrent as the idea of invading a sovereign country. Do you think it's a reasonable thing, or do you think that that's just a matter of geopolitical interests?
Well, historically, Europeans hated each other savagely. Europe was the hotbed. For the past generation, it's not been. But that's rare for the Europeans to think it abhorrent to invade another country. There's the Anglo-French wars, the Franco-German wars. These people were always at war. Now they were exhausted, and they were peace-loving people who were shocked. The Russians, however, were not shocked. They knew America. They knew America could act aggressively, as a great power does, and they were afraid they were next on the list. So I will say that the war began with the Balkan Wars, was intensified by Maidan Square. We had no intention of invading Russia. That was not on our plate. But he couldn't know that. He had to plan the worst case. As for it being abhorrent to invade other countries, Europe has done that for centuries. Each other countries, India, whatever. So the moralism that I hear now is hilarious. I mean,
Sorry, George, you set a lot of this out in your book Flashpoints that came out about a decade ago or so now, which is about the emerging crisis in Europe. Let's just move on because I want to put a few points to you. Others have suggested that what Putin also wants in this, actually, let me just put a few points to you, a few arguments that people have made saying why they think Russia's won the war or might win the war, and you can tell me why they're wrong. So others have suggested that Putin wants a seat at the top table geopolitically. He wants to reverse what he called the geopolitical catastrophe of the collapse of the Soviet Union and make Russia a power on par with the US again. I mean, has he not now got this by having these negotiations with Trump? What do you think?
Well, it depends how the negotiations end. His situation is very weak. He has demonstrated that his military is incapable of occupying a small country after 3 years. He now claims he only wanted what he had. But if you look at the map, he went much farther and had to retreat. So the credibility of his military force was shattered. The internal economy of Russia was badly hurt by the war, by the embargoes, by the banking systems, and the oligarchs that brought him to power have either left the country or are quite upset because they have been badly hurt. And the Russian public has had hardships because of this war. A 3-year war that did not achieve its goal, that left it isolated in the world, but economically also weakened. So Putin is sitting in a very delicate political position. He certainly has opposition inside of Russia to this war. He wouldn't have had it if he won. He'd be a hero. But he didn't. He didn't get it. He can't claim to them, oh, we only wanted this little piece. They know better, we know better, and anyone who doesn't look at a map of the war would know better. You have to not know the war to know what they wanted, to think they wanted this. So he's in a position now where he's not working to become a great power. He had been. That had been part of his goal. He's now working to hold on to his position in this country, as Lyndon Johnson did after the Vietnam War. He went away in a more peaceful way. In Russia, when there was a coup d'etat in the middle of the war by his friends, he solved that by crashing an airplane with everybody on board. There's a vicious fight that has to come out from this, just as there's a vicious fight in the United States over Vietnam. And after Vietnam, recriminations, the president was replaced, and all these things happened when you lose a war. Putin is now Lyndon Johnson. He screwed up. Now, what happens to him? I think Trump is looking at him as, this is the man I want running Russia. In order to do that, I have to give him a victory. That doesn't cost us anything. And I think in these negotiations, the victory is to bypass his goals for Ukraine, demonstrate an entente with the Russians and the Saudis, which are important but not relevant to this discussion. And he's doing everything to reassure Putin so he can tell his people, this is not another American trap. It's real. And I think that Zelenskyy, if it was incidental, it was very useful. If it was planned, it was quite smart. The United States broke with Ukraine and said to the Russians, Ukraine isn't the issue, guy. It wasn't what the war was about. It was your relationship to us. We can have a good relationship. Here's Ukraine. I'm not giving it to you, but I'm not going to hold it.
I mean, the idea of a kind of internal Russian battle, I think it's easy for us here to think that all that's on Putin's mind is what's happening west of him. But of course, there is plenty of domestic and economic pressures on him. The idea of a battle coming up for the control of Russia is interesting. George, you said there that Trump wants Putin to be in control of Russia. Why do you think that? Is it because he's weak?
Yes, because we have our further enemy under the control of a political leader who has failed in a major operation and is politically weak. He doesn't want Stalin. He wants the core strength of Russia now is the oligarchs. The oligarchs are essentially European. They want to do business. The war prevented them from doing business. Many went bankrupt. It was really bad. But it was the oligarchs that brought Putin to power. He great power. So now he has to deal, as any leader would, with the economic and political and social disruption, the feeling that we don't know how many million Russians died. The numbers go around, but there were a lot. As after Vietnam, Lyndon Johnson couldn't stand. He couldn't survive. In fact, the Democrats ultimately gave way to Ronald Reagan. But we had more room to maneuver. So Putin is inside of Russia, claiming we really won the war because this is what we want. But nobody believes him. And so now, if Putin can become the point at which reconciliation is made, the oligarchs can be happy. The embargoes are off, the banks are opened, US investment can come in. So this is a maneuver by Trump to use the weakness of Putin to make him hostage, for example. Because if there is no peace, if the war goes on, there's a lot of people in Russia who are not going to be happy. There are already a lot of people.
And look, let's look ahead. Geopolitical Futures, of course, does a lot of forecasting. That's kind of the point. Putin doesn't have his buffer zone in Ukraine. He hasn't got what he wanted out of it. The Ukraine is obviously worried that a ceasefire, a truce that doesn't suit them will mean that Russia will go back and try again in a few months, a few years. What do you think is the likelihood of that?
It was as likely as the next president reinvading Vietnam. You've lost the war. What makes you think you'll win it this time? This time you double cross Trump. Donald Trump gets double crossed. He sends in the Marines. He's positioning himself as a madman. Don't screw with a madman. He may well be a madman. Either way, posing or being real. What does the United States do if Putin double crosses him? He can't survive that. So he doesn't have the military strength to do this time, after all his losses, what he couldn't do the first time with his force intact. Secondly, the American response may not be just sending weapons this time, but coming after him. He doesn't know that. Under those circumstances, the risk of doing it over again would also upset everybody else who says this has to stop. For 3 years, there's been wreckage in our economy. There are uprisings in Siberia, of all places. The Russians aren't happy with this any more than the Americans were happy with Vietnam. So I don't think the European fear about a Russian invasion is 3 years too late. When they could have done something, they didn't. So this is said to be the coalition of the willing. Willing what? The Europeans are not a country. They're a continent. The French don't trust the Germans. No one trusts the French. Who's going to command this army? NATO was commanded by an American. Who commands the European army? These countries can't come together. And this gives Trump room for maneuver. He doesn't see the Europeans as players. He doesn't see them, your opinion is important. He also sees a rising, we talk about the liberal world, the liberal democratic world. Well, he looks at Germany, and he looks at elections in France, and he looks around and he sees a rising of anti-immigration moves. So he sees a political force arising that opposes the old order. So Europe does not present itself as a reliable ally. It wasn't a reliable ally. It also sent weapons. It didn't. He said during the campaign, this was not an American war. This was a European war. Where were the Europeans? Well, they sent weapons. We sent weapons. Nobody really jumped into it. But for the Europeans now to complain that we must stand against aggression, where were they 3 years ago?
Well, I think European defence could be a topic for a future podcast, perhaps, or what Europe does next anyway.
But it's key to these negotiations. The Americans don't want the Europeans at the table because there are no Europeans. There are only Frenchmen and Italians and everything. The Europeans would not have a coherent position, but they don't want to be shut out. They won't put up the chips, but they want to sit at the poker table. And Trump basically says, you're out of it. And they feel bypassed. And they were bypassed. They allowed themselves. So it's key to understand what's going on. He thinks he knows, the only one to deal with is the Russians. They're players, potential players. What the Europeans feel, they're not even of common, between countries, within countries, they have no common view.
I mean, what the Europeans often say now, as this discussion is going around, is that, put together, the European countries have contributed as much as the US, or broadly, depending on how you measure it.
So now they can do more.
Right.
So, ever since World War I, when the Americans intervened to stabilize the Western Front, ever since World War II, when the Americans were drawn in, the Europeans have depended on the Americans. During the Cold War, they depended on the Americans. He's saying Europe is not in a shambles. It's not been backed against the wall. Europe is a prosperous, capable country. Take the risks. Don't push them on us this time. And the Europeans don't want to hear that. They want to hear that the Americans are abandoning their obligation to defend the world. Trump is saying, we have no obligation to defend the world. We did it in World War I and World War II, in the Cold War. We had our interests. We don't have an interest. You have the capability of doing it. Don't call on us.
George, final question. Forecasting again, what comes after Putin? Putin's 72. He might not be in power for long if the oligarchs or whoever else decide he's not done a good job with this war. What comes after him?
Don't look at personalities. Personalities come and go and die. What happens to Russia? When Putin came in, when the communists came in, they were tsars. It was not their children that came to power, but they were tsars. Russia can return to the Tsarist period, but the infrastructure of oppression isn't there. The Communist Party controlled Russia because there were many communists who reported to the KGB, and dissent was treated. The edifice of oppression isn't there. The Russian people are much more free than they were. Will they be a liberal democracy? That's alien to their culture, but it may well emerge. But whatever the new Russian leader will be is concerned with internal stabilization, looking for outside help, and the Americans will have an open door if this ends well, if to do that. So what happens inside of Russia, I suspect, will be a re-examination of their history. The influence of America, which on Germany was great, for example, on Europe was great, being very invasive, and the Americans having an interest in a Russia that is a different character, but healthy, not necessarily with a major army, just as they wanted Europe to be after the war.
George, as always, great to talk to you. Thanks very much for coming on the podcast.
A pleasure.
Talking Geopolitics is brought to you by Geopolitical Futures, your source for geopolitical forecasting and analysis.